The air in Dust Haven, Nevada territory, was made of three things: sunlight, silence, and a fine golden grit that settled on everything, from the brims of hats to the bottoms of souls. In the year of our Lord 1887, the town was more dust than haven, a place scraped out of the earth between sun-scorched mountains and wells that had long ago surrendered their water. Hope was the only currency that had not yet run dry, though it was often spent as foolishly as a miner's first strike. From her stool behind the counter of Henderson's general store, Ada Wren watched the town live and breathe through its coating of dust. At 28, Ada was as much a fixture as the Cracker Barrel or the perpetually sleeping cat. She kept Mr. Henderson's books, her handwriting a neat, forward-slanting script that betrayed none of the world's messiness. She also mended torn shirts and stitched new dresses, her fingers nimble and sure. The people of Dust Haven knew her, but they did not see her. They called her Plain Ada. It was not a title given with malice, but with the casual cruelty of fact. Her face was thin, her hair the color of dried grass, and her eyes a shade of brown that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. She was a woman drawn in pencil, easily overlooked in a world painted with garish oils. Saturday was market day, and the town's main street churned with a sluggish energy. Ada had been sent to fetch a new blade for the store's bacon slicer from the blacksmith. She moved through the crowd with an economy of motion, her gray skirts whispering over the dusty ground. She nodded politely to those she passed, receiving faint, distracted smiles in return. It was near the makeshift stall where a farmer sold dusty-looking potatoes that the words found her. They were not meant for her ears, but words, like dust, have a way of getting in everywhere. It is a shame. Is it not the voice belonged to Mildred Gable, the mayor's wife, a woman whose opinions were as broad as her considerable frame, all that industry, and no husband to show for it. 28 years old. Her companion, a wispy woman named Beatrice, sighed dramatically. Well, Mildred. You have to admit, the girl is just too plain, too ugly to marry. A man wants something to please the eye. Ada froze, her hand hovering over a sack of potatoes. The blacksmith's shop was just across the way, its rhythmic clang a steady heartbeat against the sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She had heard the whispers before, of course. She had felt the pitying glances and seen the dismissive shrugs. But to hear the judgment spoken so plainly, so utterly without reservation, felt like a physical blow. She forced herself to take a breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the universe, it seemed, was not finished with its lesson in humility. A roar of laughter erupted from the direction of the saloon. Jedediah Stone, a miner whose fortune had been washed away by whiskey, staggered into the street, his face a roadmap of poor decisions. He caught sight of Ada standing alone, a still point in the swirling market day. He pointed a wavering finger at her, his voice booming across the street, silencing the low hum of commerce. There she is, plain Ada Wren, you ladies talking about marrying her off. He let out another braying laugh. Why, even a blind prospector would not marry her for all the gold in the creek. A terrible silence fell. For a moment, every eye in the street was on her. They were not cruel eyes, not all of them. Some were filled with pity, others with embarrassment. But they were all looking. They were all seeing her through Jedediah's words as something wanting, something less. The heat of their collective gaze was more punishing than the Nevada sun. Ada's face remained a mask of calm composure. She turned, without a word, and walked toward the blacksmith's, her back as straight as the steel rulers she used for her sewing. She did not run, she did not falter. She collected the blade, paid the smith, and walked back to the general store, the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, in the small room behind her modest sewing shop, Ada lit a lamp. The light cast a soft glow on the spools of thread, the bolts of calico, and the half-finished dress on its mannequin. This was her sanctuary, a world she could control with a needle and thread. But tonight, The tidy room felt like a cage. The whispers from the market echoed in the quiet. Too plain, too ugly. She sat on her narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. They solved nothing. Instead, a slow, burning anger began to smolder within her. It was not an anger at Mildred Gable or the drunken miner. It was an anger at the world's rigid, unthinking assessments. Her worth, her entire being, had been weighed and measured by the slope of her nose and the color of her hair, and it had been found wanting. Was that all a person was? A collection of features to be approved or discarded? An idea began to form in her mind, quiet and sharp as the point of a new needle. She would not accept their verdict. She would not simply endure their pity. She would do something, not for them, but for herself. She rose and went to her small writing desk. From a drawer, she took out a clean sheet of paper, an envelope, and her pen. For a long time, she simply stared at the blank page. What could she say? How could she articulate the feeling of being a ghost in her own life? She thought of the matrimonial advertisements she sometimes read in the newspapers that passed through the general store. Women who were comely and fair, who could bake a fine pie and keep a Christian home, men who wanted a handsome wife of good breeding. It was all a marketplace, like the one where she had been so thoroughly devalued that morning. She would not sell herself. She would not list her virtues like items in a ledger. She dipped her pen in the ink. Her purpose was not to find a husband. It was simply to be heard, to write her existence into the world and have it acknowledged, just once, on her own terms. She wanted to prove, if only to the silent witness of a printed page, that a woman like her deserved to be seen. The letter was short. To the editor, I write to you not in search of a matrimonial match, but in search of a correspondence. I am a woman of 28 years, of sound mind and quiet disposition. I believe a person's true worth is not measured by the pleasing arrangement of their features, nor is it found in the clamor of public opinion. I wish to exchange letters with a gentleman who shares this belief. I seek nothing more than the sincere exchange of thoughts, a brief respite from a world that is often too quick to judge what it does not understand. Respectfully, A. Rendust Haven, Nevada Territory. She read it over, the ink still gleaming wetly in the lamplight. It was honest. It was her. She folded the paper, sealed it in the envelope, and wrote the address for the Western Matrimonial Post on the front. Tomorrow, she would send it with the stagecoach, a small, quiet act of rebellion. It would probably come to nothing, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than resignation. Hundreds of miles away, in a city that glittered with the spoils of the earth, a man sat in a shadowed room, the ghost of a different life clinging to him like the scent of stale cigar smoke. Elias Monroe had once been called the gold tycoon of Carson City. He had owned mines, banks, and the loyalties of powerful men. He had built an empire on rock and risk, and he had watched it all crumble into dust, brought down by his own insatiable greed and the betrayal of those he trusted. Now he lived quietly, under an assumed name, with just enough money to be comfortable but not enough to attract attention. He was searching for something, though he could not have named it, a way back, perhaps. Not to the wealth, but to the man he had been before the gold had poisoned him. He was thumbing through a stack of old newspapers, the pages brittle and dry. He had no interest in the news of politics or finance. He was looking for stories of people, of ordinary lives, hoping to find a map in their simple journeys. He found himself reading the back pages, the advertisements for liver pills and cheap land. His eyes scanned the columns of the Western Matrimonial Post with a kind of weary amusement. It was the same old song, transactions of the heart, negotiated on paper. Then he saw it, a small notice from a place called Dust Haven. It was different from the others. It did not offer a dowry or promise a pretty face. It did not speak of piety or domestic skill. It spoke of worth, of judgment, of a quiet desire to be understood. It asked for nothing but an exchange of thoughts. A wren. The name was as simple and unassuming as the letter itself. Elias read the words again, and then a third time. In that short, spare message, he heard an echo of his own solitude. Here was someone else who felt unseen, who understood that the world's valuation was a fickle and often cruel thing. The letter was a small, steady light in the vast, noisy darkness of the world he was trying to escape. He tore the column from the newspaper, folded it carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket. He did not know why. It was a foolish impulse, but the words from that dusty, forgotten town had taken root in his mind, a quiet and persistent whisper of something genuine, something real, something that might, just might, be worth finding. A week after Ada Wren's letter began its journey, a new wind blew into Dust Haven. It arrived with a midday stagecoach, a gust of heat and grit that deposited a single passenger onto the town's main street. The man was tall, dressed in the durable, nondescript clothing of a prospector, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. He moved with a quiet purpose, his boots sinking softly into the thick dust as if he were testing the ground beneath him. He carried one worn leather satchel, and none of the loud, boisterous hope that usually accompanied new arrivals. This was Elias Monroe. Though no one in Dust Haven would have known the name, the gold tycoon of Carson City was buried, and in his place stood Elias Jones, a man looking to rework a forgotten claim just east of town, the old Black Creek mine. It was a lie, but one built on a foundation of truth. He was indeed investigating the mine, a property he had lost in the spectacular collapse of his fortunes. He had heard whispers that the vein was not as played out as everyone believed, and he was here, incognito, to see for himself. It was a long shot, a chance to reclaim a piece of what was once his, but without the fanfare and the vultures that his real name would attract. As he scanned the tired, sun-bleached storefronts, his eyes landed on the sign for the post office, which also served as the general store. Dust Haven. The name resonated with a faint, familiar chime. He paused, his hand instinctively going to the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out the folded, brittle piece of newspaper. He did not need to read it. He knew the words by heart. A. Wren, Dust Haven, Nevada Territory. So, this was the place, the home of the quiet, dignified letter that had felt like a drink of cool water in the desert of his self-imposed exile. The thought brought a faint, ironic smile to his lips. He had come seeking gold, but his curiosity was now piqued by something else entirely. He pushed open the door to Henderson's General Store, a bell announcing his entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed out of place in the silent, dusty air. The interior was a cavern of organized clutter, smelling of coffee beans, burlap, and leather. Behind the long wooden counter, a woman was dipping a pen into an inkwell, her head bent over a large ledger. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, polite. "Good day," she said, her voice low and steady. "Can I help you?" Elias took in her appearance in a single, comprehensive glance. A thin face, plain as a prairie flower, hair the color of straw, pulled back neatly, a simple, well-mended dress. There was nothing remarkable about her, and yet he found himself watching the way her hands rested on the open ledger, the fingers long and capable. She was the woman from the potato stall, the one the drunk had shouted at. He recognized her now, plain Ada Wren. "Morning," he replied, his voice a little rough from the journey. He set his satchel down by the door. "Just arrived in town, looking to get some supplies." "You have come to the right place," she said, closing the ledger and giving him her full attention. "What do you need?" He listed off his requirements: flour, coffee, beans, bacon, a new pickaxe handle. She moved about the store with a quiet efficiency, gathering the items without any wasted motion. He noticed she did not hum or make idle chatter. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained quality that he found strangely compelling. She weighed the flour, wrapped the bacon in butcher's paper, and placed everything on the counter. Will that be all she asked? Her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. They were brown, he noted, and held a depth that her plain features did not immediately suggest. For now, he said, pulling a small leather pouch from his pocket and counting out the coins. Her fingers brushed his briefly as she took the money, and he felt a surprising jolt, a current of life that seemed at odds with her reserved demeanor. She felt nothing, or at least, she showed nothing. It was just another transaction in a long day of transactions. Over the next few days, Elias established his camp at the abandoned Black Creek mine. The work was hard, clearing rubble and re-timbering the entrance, but he welcomed the physical exhaustion. It quieted the ghosts of his past. He made regular trips into town for supplies, and each time he found himself in the general store, under the calm, watchful gaze of Ada Wren. Their interactions were brief and always the same. He would state his needs. She would fulfill them. Yet he began to notice things, the way she always kept a fresh pot of coffee simmering on the stove for weary travelers, the way she gave a piece of licorice to a small child whose mother could not afford it, a gesture done so subtly it was almost invisible. He saw the care she took in her work, whether she was stacking tins or mending a tear in a farmer's canvas coat. One afternoon, he brought in a shirt that had ripped at the shoulder seam. "I was told you do mending," he said, laying the garment on the counter. She picked it up, examining the tear with a professional eye. "I do," she confirmed. "It is a simple fix. You can have it by morning." "Thank you," he said. He hesitated, then added, "I am Elias Jones." She looked up from the shirt, a flicker of surprise in her eyes that a stranger would offer his name. "Ada Wren," she replied, the name falling from her lips with a simple finality. Wren. The connection clicked into place, solid and undeniable. This was her, the woman who had written the letter, the woman who sought a respite from a world that was too quick to judge. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the plainness of her face to the quiet strength that held her spine so straight. He saw the author of those brave, lonely words. And he was standing before her under a false name, a man hiding from his own past, a past that was the very embodiment of the world's shallow judgments. The irony was as sharp as a shard of glass. "It will be 10 cents, she said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "Of course," he replied, reaching for his coin purse. When he returned the next morning, the shirt was neatly folded on the counter, the seam stitched so perfectly it was stronger than the original fabric. "You do fine work, Miss Wren," he said, genuinely impressed. "It is what I do," she answered simply. She poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and pushed it across the counter toward him. "For the wait." "That is kind of you." He took the cup, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into his calloused hands. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. The only sounds, the ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft hiss of the coffee pot. He wanted to ask her about the letter. He wanted to tell her that he had read it, that he understood. But how could he, Elias Jones, the simple miner, would have no reason to read such a paper? And Elias Monroe, the disgraced Tycoon, had no right to speak of sincerity. So he said nothing. He just drank his coffee and watched as she meticulously sharpened a pencil with a small penknife, the shavings curling onto a piece of scrap paper. For Ada, the presence of this quiet stranger was a small, unsettling disturbance in the placid waters of her life. He was unlike the other miners, who were either loud and boastful or sullen and defeated. Mr. Jones was watchful. He did not look through her, as most people did. He looked at her, his gaze direct and thoughtful, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. She was not used to being looked at that way, and it made her profoundly uncomfortable. She found herself retreating further into her shell, her replies becoming even more concise, her movements more guarded. She was hiding, and she knew it. Hiding from the hope that his quiet attention might mean something, because hope was a dangerous thing. It had a way of turning into disappointment, and disappointment was a pain she had grown tired of feeling. She was plain Ada Wren. A man like him, even a simple miner, could surely do better. She was a woman who was too ugly to marry. She had to remember that. It was her shield, her protection against the foolishness of her own heart. And so they stood on opposite sides of the counter, two people hiding from themselves and each other. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of their respective pasts. And all around them, unnoticed on the floorboards and shimmering in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the grimy windows, lay a fine coating of gold dust, the hidden, overlooked value of the earth, waiting for someone to see it for what it truly was. Not all shadows in Dust Haven were cast by the sun. Some were cast by men. Sheriff Cade Morrison was one such man. He was broad-shouldered and carried his authority like a second pistol, holstered and ready. He had a smile that never reached his eyes, and a belief, solid as bedrock, that the world was a simple place with simple rules. Men worked, women married, and the order of things was not to be disturbed. 2 years prior, he had decided he would marry Ada Wren. It was not a matter of affection, but of convenience and, in his mind, charity. She was quiet, industrious, and would run a home with neat efficiency. He would be doing her a service, lifting her from a life of spinsterhood. He had presented the idea to her as one might present a deed of ownership, expecting gratitude. He received, instead, a polite but unyielding refusal. The rejection had stunned him, then curdled into a quiet, simmering resentment. A woman like her, a plain and penniless seamstress, had no right to refuse a man like him. It was an affront to the natural order. He had watched her since. His gaze, a proprietary weight she often felt but could never prove. And he had noticed the arrival of the stranger, Elias Jones. He saw the way the man's visits to the general store lingered a moment longer than necessary, the way his eyes followed Ada as she moved behind the counter, and he saw it as a threat, not to any romantic notion, for he had none, but to his own bruised pride. This quiet, dusty prospector was receiving the attention Cade himself had been denied. The sheriff chose his moment carefully. He entered the store one afternoon when Elias was standing at the counter, waiting for Ada to finish wrapping a length of rope. The bell jingled, and Ada's back stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Afternoon, Ada," Cade said, his voice overly familiar. He leaned an elbow on the counter, his presence filling the small space. "You seem to be getting a lot of business from the old Black Creek claim." He looked at Elias, a slow, assessing glance that was both a greeting and a challenge. "Sheriff Cade Morrison." "Elias Jones," Elias replied, his voice even. He gave a slight nod, not offering a hand. Cade's smile widened, but it remained cold. "Jones, just passing through. Or are you planning on striking it rich where better men have failed?" "Just seeing what the earth has to offer," Elias said vaguely. The sheriff turned his attention back to Ada, his gaze sweeping over her. "You ought to be careful, Ada. Strangers come and go. They can fill a girl's head with foolish ideas, make promises they have no intention of keeping." His words were for her, but his eyes were on Elias. It was a clear, unmistakable warning. Ada finished tying the knot on the rope and pushed it toward Elias, her face a neutral mask. "Will that be all?" "Mr. Jones?" she asked. Her voice clipped. She did not acknowledge the sheriff's comment. The deliberate slight did not go unnoticed. Cade's jaw tightened. He watched Elias pay and leave, then turned back to Ada. "He seems to have loosened your tongue. You have said more to him in a week than you have said to me in a year." "I am running a business, Sheriff," Ada said, turning to organize a stack of tinned peaches. "I speak to customers." "Just make sure that is all you are doing," he said, his voice low. "A woman alone has to protect her reputation, especially a woman like you." He left the store, the bell jingling with a final, jarring note. Ada stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hand resting on a tin of peaches, her knuckles white. Cade's poison began to seep into the town's bloodstream that very evening. In the smoky confines of the saloon, he shared a drink with a few of the town's more influential gossips. "It is a curious thing," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Our plain Ada, who would not give a man the time of day, suddenly finds all the time in the world for that stranger, Jones. He is in the store every day, buying a nail here, a bag of flour there. A man might think he is prospecting for something other than gold. He let the insinuation hang in the air, and a man might wonder what she is offering in return for all that attention." The rumor took root in the fertile soil of the town's preconceived notions. It was easier to believe that Ada was manipulative than to believe a man might simply find her company pleasant. It fit their narrative. By the end of the week, the change was palpable. The polite, distant smiles Ada usually received were replaced with cool, assessing stares. Whispers fell silent when she approached. Mildred Gable, the mayor's wife, came into the store and inspected 3 different bolts of fabric before declaring them all subpar and leaving without a purchase, her nose in the air. Ada felt the chill as keenly as a winter wind. It was the market day all over again, but this time it was not a single, sharp blow. It was a slow, steady erosion of her place in the community. She was no longer just the plain spinster. She was the calculating one, the woman who would use her wiles to trap a stranger. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. What wiles, what charms, yet the town believed it. She retreated further into herself, her silence becoming a fortress. She met their suspicion with a quiet, unbreachable wall of dignity. She did her work, kept her books, and spoke only when necessary. Elias saw it all. He saw the averted eyes and the sudden silences. He was a man who had lived with public disgrace. He knew the scent of social ostracism. He also found himself drawn into a different kind of conflict. The sheriff's interest in him was not merely personal. Cade began making official inquiries about the Black Creek claim, asking to see paperwork Elias did not have, hinting at forgotten county regulations and disputed boundary lines. Elias realized that Cade was not just trying to drive him away from Ada. He was probing for a weakness, a way to gain leverage over the mine itself. The disgraced tycoon in him recognized the moves of a small-time predator circling a potentially valuable asset. The twin pressures, the town's coldness toward Ada and the sheriff's menacing interest in his claim, pushed Elias into a state of heightened observation. He found himself watching Ada constantly, not with pity, but with a growing, grudging admiration. He saw her absorb the town's silent condemnation without flinching. He saw her treat Mildred Gable with the same dispassionate courtesy as any other customer. She never complained, never offered a defense, never once looked for an ally or sought a sympathetic ear. One rainy afternoon, he was the only customer in the store. He was buying a new lantern globe, and as she wrapped it in paper, a group of children ran past the storefront, splashing mud onto the windows. One of them, a young boy with threadbare clothes, slipped and fell hard in the muck. His mother, a weary-looking woman Elias had seen around town, rushed out and began scolding the crying child, her voice sharp with frustration. Ada watched them for a moment. Then, she walked out from behind the counter, took a clean rag and a small piece of hard candy, and went outside. She knelt in the mud, ignoring the rain that dampened her hair, and gently wiped the boy's scraped hands. She said something to him, her voice too low for Elias to hear, and then pressed the candy into his palm. The boy's sobs subsided. The mother's harsh expression softened into one of weary gratitude. Ada gave the woman a small, tight nod and came back inside, her shoes and the hem of her skirt soiled with mud. She said nothing of it, simply returned to the counter and finished wrapping the globe. In that small, quiet act, Elias saw the entirety of her character. The world could throw its mud at her, call her names, and cast its judgments, but it could not touch the core of her. She did not ask for praise or thanks. She did not perform her kindness for an audience. She simply did what was right, then returned to her work. She possessed a form of pride he had never encountered before, a pride that had nothing to do with wealth or status or appearance. It was a deep, internal strength, a quiet refusal to be broken by the world's casual cruelties. And as he stood there, watching her wipe the mud from her hands, Elias Monroe, the man who was hiding from his own gilded past, felt an undeniable pull toward the plain woman who asked for nothing and deserved everything. The annual church social was meant to be the purest expression of community in Dust Haven, a brief truce with the grit and the hardship of daily life. Lanterns strung between the posts of the livery stable and the church itself cast a warm, flickering glow on the long trestle tables laden with pies, fried chicken, and potato salad. The sound of a wheezing accordion struggled to rise above the hum of conversation, a cheerful but fragile noise against the vast silence of the desert night. Ada moved along the edges of the gathering, a ghost in a freshly pressed but unremarkable brown dress. Her duty for the evening was to serve punch, a task she performed with her usual quiet efficiency. It kept her hands busy and gave her a reason to be present but apart, an observer at her own town's celebration. She saw it all from her station, the young couples stealing glances, the businessmen talking claims and profits, the women trading gossip behind their fans. Elias Jones was there, a solid, watchful presence near the corner of the church. He had nodded to her upon his arrival, a silent acknowledgement that felt more substantial than all the empty chatter around them. He did not mingle, like her. He seemed to be an island in the sluggish stream of the social. She felt his gaze on her from time to time, and it was a strange comfort, a single, steady point in a shifting sea of judgment. Sheriff Cade Morrison was there as well, making his rounds like a rancher inspecting his herd. He paused before Ada's punch bowl, his shadow falling over her. "Enjoying yourself, Ada?" he asked, his tone suggesting she had no right to. "It is a pleasant evening, Sheriff," she replied, not looking up from her ladle. "See that it stays that way," he said, his eyes flicking toward Elias and then back to her. "This town does not take kindly to disruptions." With that, he moved on, leaving a chill in the air. The moment of crisis, when it came, was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, verbal shiv, delivered with a smile. Mildred Gable, the mayor's wife, stood at the center of a small flock of the town's most influential women. They were discussing the lamentable lack of eligible wives for the men of the territory. One of the women, Beatrice, gestured vaguely with her head toward the punch table. "What about Ada Wren? She is a hard worker." Mildred Gable's voice, carrying the particular clarity of a woman who knows everyone is listening, sliced through the low chatter. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, heavens, no. A man needs a wife he can be proud of. A pretty face to come home to." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes sweeping over Ada with a look of profound pity. "The girl is, well, you know, too plain, too ugly to marry." A ripple of cruel laughter followed, light and sharp like the cracking of whips. It was not a roar. It was worse. It was a soft, conspiratorial sound of agreement. In that instant, the wheezing accordion seemed to falter. The conversations nearby dipped into a sudden, conspicuous silence. Every eye, it seemed, turned to the plain woman standing behind the punch bowl. Across the dusty yard, Elias saw it happen. He saw the women's smiling faces and the way Ada froze, her hand clenching the silver ladle. A hot surge of fury, unfamiliar and potent, washed through him. He took a step forward, his body moving before his mind had a chance to weigh the consequences. He would not let this stand. He would not let them do this to her. But before he could take a second step, she moved. She had seen his intent, the sudden tension in his shoulders. She met his eyes across the distance, and with a barely perceptible shake of her head, she warned him off. He ignored it, his jaw set. He started toward Mildred's group, but Ada was faster. She intercepted him, placing a light, firm hand on his forearm. The touch was electric, a silent, desperate plea. "Do not," she murmured, her voice impossibly steady. He looked down at her. In the flickering lantern light, her face was a pale, composed mask, but her eyes held a universe of old hurts. "They have no right," he ground out, his voice a low growl. She looked away from him, toward the women who were now pretending to be engrossed in a new topic of conversation. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Let them talk," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. "Words can't break what's already cracked." She removed her hand from his arm, gave him one last look, and then turned. Without haste, without a single sign of distress, she walked to the church, set down her ladle, and disappeared into the darkness at the side of the building. She did not flee, she simply withdrew. Elias stood rooted to the spot, the imprint of her hand still burning on his arm. He watched her go, a profound sense of helplessness washing over him. He looked at the laughing, oblivious faces of the townspeople, and for the first time since his downfall, he felt the old, familiar rage of the gold tycoon, the man who bent the world to his will. But that man was gone, and Elias Jones, the prospector, had no power here. An hour later, the wind picked up, a dry, restless sigh that swept down from the mountains. It carried with it the finest particles of dust from the surrounding mines, a ghostly golden snow that swirled in the lantern light. The party began to break up, people shielding their faces as they hurried home. Elias barely noticed. He was walking through the deserted main street, his steps guided by a singular purpose. He found her in the small sewing room behind the general store. The door was slightly ajar, and a weak, sputtering light emanated from within. He pushed it open gently. She was seated on a stool, her back to him, hunched over a small piece of fabric. The lamp on her work table was nearly out of oil, its flame guttering and casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the dimness, he could see that she was mending a child's shirt, her needle moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She did not seem to have heard him enter. He watched her for a long moment. This woman who, after being publicly flayed, had retreated to her sanctuary to mend a shirt for an orphan. He saw her not as plain, not as ugly, but as something rare and beautiful. A quiet, resilient flame burning steadfastly in a world of wind and darkness. The lamp sputtered violently and then went out, plunging the room into near total blackness, the only light a pale wash of moonlight through the single window. She startled, a small gasp escaping her lips. "Who is there?" "It is me," he said softly. "Elias Jones." He heard her let out a slow breath. The door was not latched. "I know." He moved into the room, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dark. He could make out her silhouette, still and tense. "I have a match." He struck it on the sole of his boot, the flare of sulfur and light momentarily blinding him. He crossed to the table and, with practiced hands, removed the globe from her lamp, trimmed the wick, and lit it. He adjusted the flame until it burned with a clean, steady glow, pushing the shadows back into the corners. He replaced the globe, his large, rough fingers moving with a surprising delicacy. She watched him, her hands still clutching the child's shirt. "Thank you," she whispered. He pulled up another stool and sat opposite her at the small table. "Are you all right?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I am accustomed to it." "You should not have to be—" She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the warm lamplight. "And are you accustomed to being the talk of the town? Mr. Jones, the stranger who is so interested in the plain seamstress." He met her gaze without flinching. "I have been the subject of talk before. It has never bothered me." He paused. "What they said tonight, it was a lie." She looked down at her hands. "The truth is a matter of perspective, I suppose." She fell silent, and, in the quiet, he felt the immense weight of her loneliness. It was a feeling he knew well. "I know what it is to be alone," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. Even in a crowded room. Her head came up, her eyes wide with a raw vulnerability that stole his breath. "I am not afraid of being alone," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I am afraid of dying alone, of leaving this world without anyone ever having truly seen me." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and profound. He saw it then, the deep crack she had spoken of, the fracture line of a lifetime of being overlooked. He felt an overwhelming urge to reach across the table, to touch her, to somehow pour his own strength into that crack and seal it forever. He rose from his stool and closed the small distance between them. She did not move, did not breathe, just watched him with those wide, wounded eyes. He lifted a hand, his calloused thumb coming to rest gently on her cheek. Her skin was soft, and he could feel a slight tremor run through her. "I see you, Ada," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I see you." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was clumsy and urgent, a collision of two solitudes. Her lips were chapped and tasted of coffee and dust and unshed tears. For a moment she was stiff with shock, and then, with a small, shuddering sigh, she yielded, her hand coming up to rest on his wrist. It was a rough, trembling, and utterly real kiss, a silent promise in the heart of the lonely dark that neither of them was truly alone anymore. In the days that followed, the church social, a fragile new world began to take shape in the quiet spaces between Ada and Elias. The kiss in the lamplit sewing room had not been spoken of, but it existed between them, a silent testament to a shared moment of raw honesty, hope, an emotion Ada had long ago packed away like a dress she would never wear again, began to tentatively unfold itself within her. He took to stopping by the store at the end of each day, not always to buy something, but just to share a cup of coffee and a few moments of quiet conversation before she closed the books. He spoke of the mine, of the challenge of clearing the rock falls and the small signs of a promising vein. She spoke of her work, of the families she sewed for, of the small, intricate dramas of the town that she observed from behind her counter. In his presence, she felt the rigid set of her shoulders relax. She felt, for the first time, seen. One evening, he reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the counter. It was a single, rough nugget of gold, no bigger than her thumbnail, shot through with veins of white quartz. It was not polished or refined, but it held a deep, buttery luster. He had threaded it onto a simple leather cord. "I found it yesterday," he said, his voice low. "It is not much, but it made me think of you." She looked from the nugget to his face, a question in her eyes. "It is not shiny or perfect," he explained, his gaze steady. "You have to look closely to see its worth. It was just lying there in the dirt, waiting." Her breath caught in her throat. He was not just giving her a piece of gold. He was giving her back a piece of herself, the part the world had always told her was worthless. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The metal was cool and heavy in her palm. Without a word, she allowed him to fasten the cord around her neck. The nugget rested in the hollow of her throat, a small, secret weight of affirmation. The world shattered 2 days later. It arrived with the weekly freight wagon from Carson City. The driver, a burly man named Silas Croft, swung down from his seat, wiping dust and sweat from his face. He was halfway to the saloon when he spotted Elias crossing the street from the blacksmith shop. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping. "By all that is holy," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet midday air. "Elias Monroe, I heard you fell off the face of the earth." The name dropped into the silence of Dust Haven's main street like a boulder into a still pond. Elias froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. Heads turned. The men lounging on the porch of the general store sat up straighter. From his office across the street, Sheriff Cade Morrison emerged, his eyes narrowed with a sudden, intense interest. "Monroe," someone whispered, as in the gold Tycoon. Silas, oblivious to the shockwave he had created and delighted to be the center of attention. strode forward and clapped Elias on the back. "What are you doing in a dust bowl like this? Mr. Monroe, I used to haul ore for your Northern Star mine before the big bust. Of course." Elias managed a tight, grim smile, just looking into a small claim. Silas, trying to keep a low profile. "Low profile?" The driver laughed. "A man like you that is like trying to hide a mountain." Sheriff Morrison was already at Silas's elbow, his expression one of grave concern. "This man is Elias Monroe?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the gathering crowd. "The one from the newspapers. The man, they said, built his fortune on the backs of his workers and then left them with nothing when it all went bust." The freight driver, eager to share his knowledge, launched into the well-known tale of the Tycoon's dramatic downfall, embellishing it with details of supposed swindles and broken promises. Each word was a nail driven into the coffin of Elias Jones. Ada heard it all from inside the store. She had been arranging a new shipment of canned tomatoes when Silas's shout had echoed through the open door. "Elias Monroe, the Gold Tycoon." The words were a foreign language, but the meaning was brutally clear. The man she had shared coffee with, the man who had kissed her, the man who had given her the small, precious nugget that still rested against her skin, was a lie. He was not a simple miner. He was a wealthy, powerful man, a disgraced one at that. A cold sickness washed over her. Every shared silence, every quiet conversation, every look that she had foolishly interpreted as genuine affection was recast in a harsh, new light. It was pity. It had to be. He was a great man brought low, and in his exile, he had found the town's plainest woman and decided to make her his charitable project. The thought was a humiliation so profound it eclipsed every insult she had ever endured. He had not seen her. He had used her. He had seen a cracked and broken thing and thought to amuse himself by mending it. When Elias finally managed to extricate himself from the crowd and came into the store, her back was to him. She did not turn around. "Ada," he began, his voice strained. "You should have told me," she said, her own voice flat and lifeless. "I wanted to. It is complicated." Complicated. She finally turned, and the look on her face stopped him cold. Her eyes, usually so calm and deep, were blazing with a hurt so intense it was like a physical force. "It seems quite simple to me. Mr. Monroe, you lied. My name is a curse in this territory." He tried to explain, taking a step toward her. "I could not do business. I could not live a day in peace if people knew who I was. I came here for the mine. That is all." "And what was I?" she shot back, her voice shaking with a fury she had never known she possessed. "A diversion. A way to pass the time while you played at being a common man." "No, that is not true. Meeting you, that was never part of the plan. What happened between us is real." She let out a harsh, broken laugh. "Real nothing about you is real." Her hand went to her throat, her fingers closing around the gold nugget. This included, with a sharp tug, she snapped the leather cord. She held the small, heavy piece of gold in her open palm. "Is this how you buy people? Mr. Monroe, with pretty words and scraps from your fortune." Before he could answer, she walked past him and out the door, her skirts brushing against him. He followed her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. She did not stop until she reached the shallow, muddy creek that trickled behind the town. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows. "Ada, please," he pleaded, his voice raw. "Listen to me." She turned to face him, her eyes dark with pain. "I have listened to your lies for weeks. I will not listen to any more." And with a final, decisive gesture, she drew back her arm and threw the nugget. It made a small, unsatisfying splash in the murky water, and was gone. "I want nothing from you," she whispered, her voice cracking, "especially not your pity." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the water's edge as darkness fell. Meanwhile, Sheriff Cade Morrison was using the chaos to his full advantage. He spent the evening in the saloon, not spreading rumors, but confirming them. His expression one of grim duty. He told anyone who would listen that he had been suspicious of Jones from the start, that he was now investigating the man's claim on the Black Creek mine. A man like Monroe does not deal in honest business, Cade announced to the rapt audience of miners and townsfolk. His original title to that mine is likely as false as the name he gave us. He came here to swindle us, to steal what little this town has left right from under our noses. He had planted the seed of fear and suspicion. The town, which had already been wary of the stranger, now saw him as a villain, a predator. Later that night, in the quiet of his office, Cade unrolled an old county survey map. He lit a cigar and smiled, a thin trail of smoke curling toward the ceiling. He had a friend in the Territorial Records Office, a man with a steady hand and a flexible conscience. With the entire town seeing Elias Monroe as a liar and a thief, it would be a simple matter to produce a newly discovered deed, one that proved the Black Creek claim had been forfeited years ago and was now available to the first man with the foresight and the paperwork to claim it for the good of the community. And he, Sheriff Cade Morrison, would be that man. The sky that night was a bruised, starless canvas, heavy with an unshed violence. A hot, dry wind moaned through the canyons, picking at the loose shingles and rattling the window panes of Dust Haven. It was a weather breeder, a night for settling scores. Inside her small room, Ada sat in the dark, the child's mended shirt lying forgotten in her lap. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the force of her own pain and anger. The image of the gold nugget sinking into the muddy creek played over and over in her mind. It had been a final, defiant act, but it had brought her no peace. The wound of his deception was too deep, a jagged tear in the fragile fabric of a hope she had not even realized she was weaving. Across town, Sheriff Cade Morrison moved through the shadows with the quiet confidence of a man whose plans were falling perfectly into place. He carried a can of kerosene and a heart full of righteous greed. Monroe had isolated himself. The town saw him as a pariah, a small fire at the old mine shack. A tragic accident befalling a disgraced swindler would be the final, elegant stroke. Any papers Monroe might have, any proof of his legitimate claim, would be turned to ash. By morning, the Black Creek mine would be, for all intents and purposes, orphaned and ready for adoption. He reached the lean-to shack that Elias had built against the rock face near the mine entrance. He saw a faint light through the single grimy window. Monroe was still awake. So much the better. An accident was always more convincing with a victim. He circled the structure, liberally splashing the kerosene onto the dry, weathered wood, the acrid smell swallowed by the rising wind. He struck a match, cupping it against the gale, and tossed it onto the saturated timber. The wood caught with a hungry whoosh, flames licking instantly up the side of the shack. Ada was jolted from her stupor by the sudden, frantic ringing of the church bell. It was not the steady toll for Sunday service, but the wild, desperate clang of an alarm. She rushed to her window and saw it, a terrifying orange glow against the black hills to the east. The mine, Elias! Her mind went blank with a cold, clear dread that superseded all pain and betrayal. Liar. Tycoon. It did not matter. He was a man, and he was in danger. Before she could think, before she could weigh the foolishness of her actions, she was out the door and running, her thin nightgown whipping around her legs, the wind tearing at her hair. The wind was a living thing now, a malevolent force that hurled sand and grit into the air, scouring the landscape. The dust storm, which had been threatening all evening, descended upon the valley with the fury of a biblical plague. The world dissolved into a howling, reddish-brown chaos. Visibility dropped to near zero. Ada ran on instinct, her lungs burning, her eyes slitted against the stinging sand, guided only by the hellish, flickering light ahead. By the time she reached the mine, the shack was an inferno. Flames roared toward the bruised sky. a terrifying beacon in the swirling vortex of the storm. She saw him then, a silhouette staggering out of the mine entrance. Not the shack. He was covered in soot, a long, deep gash on his forehead bleeding freely into his eyes. He must have been in the mine when the fire started. Elias, she screamed, her voice a thin thread against the roar of the wind and fire. He saw her, and a look of sheer disbelief crossed his face. "Ada, what are you doing here? Get back! The whole thing is about to go." "Not without you," she cried, running toward him, stumbling over the uneven, rock-strewn ground. A heavy timber from the shack's roof, eaten through by the flames, crashed to the ground, sending a shower of sparks and burning embers into the air. The wind caught them, creating a swirling blizzard of fire. Elias shoved her back just as a piece of burning wood landed where she had been standing. "Get out of here," he roared, his voice cracking. "There is nothing for you here. This is my mess." But she was already shaking her head, her face set with a stubborn resolve he had come to recognize. He saw the truth in that moment. It was not pity that had brought her here, through a fire and a sandstorm. It was something else, something he had no right to, but that was undeniably there. He grabbed a damp burlap sack from a pile near the mine entrance, one he had been using to wet down the dust inside. "My satchel," he choked out, coughing as the thick smoke filled his lungs. "It is in there, my papers, the original deed." He pointed toward the burning shack. "I have to get it." "It is just paper," she screamed back at him. "It is just gold." He staggered, his vision blurring from the smoke and the blood trickling into his eyes. He leaned heavily against the rock wall of the mine entrance. "It is all I have left." And in that broken confession, Ada saw not the tycoon but the man, the lonely man who had sought refuge in a quiet town, who was trying to reclaim not just a mine, but a piece of his own lost self. The anger and betrayal she had felt dissolved, washed away by the raw, desperate reality of the man before her. She looked from his bleeding face to the raging fire, and then her eyes fell upon something glinting in the dirt near the mine entrance. Cade Morrison's silver cigar case. She had seen it 100 times in the store. He had been here. This was no accident. This was murder. The realization gave her a surge of adrenaline. She grabbed Elias's arm, pulling him away from the intense heat. "He did this. Elias, the sheriff. He did this to you." A groan of pain and understanding escaped his lips. At that moment, the sky opened, not with rain, but with a deluge. The overworked wells of Dust Haven had finally found their revenge. A flash flood, a rare and terrifying desert phenomenon, was roaring down the canyon, a wall of churning brown water and debris. The creek she had thrown the nugget into was now a raging torrent. "We have to get to higher ground," he yelled. But it was too late. The water hit them, a powerful, muddy wave that knocked them from their feet. It swept away the burning remnants of the shack in a cloud of steam and hissing embers. Ada felt herself being pulled under, the current a powerful, indifferent hand. Then she felt his grip, strong and sure, on her arm. He was fighting to keep their heads above the churning water, his strength failing. He found purchase on a large, half-submerged boulder. He clung to it with one hand, holding her fast with the other. The floodwaters swirled around them, pulling at them, the mud thick and cloying. He was weakening, the gash on his head now a livid, ugly wound. His grip was loosening. "Ada," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper above the storm. "Let me go. Save yourself." She looked at him, her plain face illuminated by flashes of lightning, her hair plastered to her skull, mud and soot streaking her skin. She looked, in that moment, like a primal force of the earth itself, fierce and unbroken. "You think I care about your gold? Elias!" she cried, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I care about the man who sees me when no one else did." With a strength born of pure desperation, she wrapped her arms around his chest, anchoring him to the rock, taking his weight as his body went limp. The storm raged around them, a symphony of wind, fire, and water. She held on, her muscles screaming, her mind focused on a single, stubborn thought: she would not let this man die. She would not let the world erase him. Hours later, as the first pale, gray light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a world transformed. The canyon was a wasteland of mud, uprooted sagebrush, and blackened debris, and clinging to a large boulder, half submerged in the thick, brown sludge, was Ada, still holding the unconscious form of Elias Monroe. She was exhausted, bruised, and caked in mud, but she was alive, and so was he. With the last of her strength, she began to pull him, inch by painstaking inch, out of the sucking mud and onto the solid, sodden ground. It was a long, agonizing process, but she did not stop. She was the plain woman who had run through fire and flood, the woman too ugly to marry, and she was saving the Golden Man. It took 2 weeks for Elias Monroe to fully mend. He woke up not in a dusty mining camp, but in a small, impossibly clean room that smelled of lavender and soap. The light was soft, filtered through a thin muslin curtain. Ada was there, sitting in a chair by the window, mending a shirt. The steady, rhythmic pass of her needle and thread was the first sound he registered, a sound of quiet order in a world he remembered as fire and chaos. His head was bandaged, and his body ached with a profound weariness. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. She was at his side in an instant, a cool cup of water at his lips. He drank greedily. "The doctor said you were lucky," she said, her voice low and even, betraying none of the terror of the night he could barely recall. "The gash on your head was deep, and you took in a great deal of smoke. You," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper, "you pulled me out." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I did." There were no questions, no accusations. In the days that followed, she tended to him with a calm, professional detachment that was more intimate than any passionate embrace. She changed his bandages, fed him broth, and read aloud to him from a worn copy of a book when the silence grew too heavy. The town doctor, a gruff but gentle man named Peterson, came and went, marveling at his patient's constitution and his nurse's steadfast care. The town, meanwhile, was a hive of speculation. Sheriff Morrison had declared the fire and flood a tragic but convenient act of God, one that had rid Dust Haven of a notorious swindler. He made it known that he was filing a formal claim on the abandoned Black Creek property on behalf of the township, a civic-minded gesture that earned him nods of approval. The story of Ada Wren's rescue was a puzzle they could not solve. Some called her a hero. Others, led by the whispers of Mildred Gable, called her a deluded fool who had risked her life for a criminal. On the 10th day, when Elias was strong enough to sit up on his own, he finally told her everything. He spoke of his father, a failed prospector, and of his own desperate, ravenous hunger for success. He confessed the hubris and greed that had led to his rise and the betrayals that had engineered his fall. He did not make excuses. He laid the ugly truth of his past before her like a hand of losing cards. "I came here to hide, Ada," he finished, his voice heavy with a shame that went deeper than his wounds. "I wanted to see if there was enough left in that mine to start again, to build something small and honest. I lied to you because I was ashamed of the man I had been. I was afraid that if you knew, you would look at me the way everyone else does." She listened without interruption, her hands resting quietly in her lap. When he was done, she rose and went to her sewing box. From beneath a pile of scraps, she retrieved a small, silver object, tarnished with mud and ash. She placed it in his hand. Cade Morrison's cigar case. "I found this near the mine entrance," she said softly, "before the flood." He stared at it, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He closed his fist around the cool metal, a cold, hard anger solidifying in his chest. It was not the rage of a wronged tycoon, but the quiet fury of a man who had been given a second chance and had nearly seen it stolen away. 4 days later, Ellis walked out of the general store and into the midday sun. He was thinner, and a pale, jagged scar now cut across his temple, but he walked with a straight-backed purpose that made people stop and stare. He crossed the dusty main street and stopped in the very center of town, the place where wagons turned and public notices were posted. Ada stood on the porch of the store, her arms crossed, watching him. It did not take long for a crowd to gather. His reappearance was an event. Sheriff Cade Morrison, alerted by his deputy, emerged from his office, a look of irritated surprise on his face. He strode toward Elias, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Monroe," Cade said, his voice loud for all to hear. "I thought you would have had the good sense to ride out of this territory. You are not welcome here." "I am not leaving," Elias replied, his voice calm but carrying in the sudden stillness. "Not until the truth is told." Cade laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "The truth? The truth is you are a fraud who came here to swindle these good people. You tried to burn your own camp to fake your death and escape your debts. But the flood caught you first." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "I have here a legally filed deed. The Black Creek Mine and all its holdings now belong to the township of Dust Haven." A murmur went through the crowd. This was what they had been told, and it seemed right. "Is that your truth?" Sheriff Elias asked, his eyes locking with Cade's. "Or is this—" He held up the silver cigar case, letting it catch the sun. "You were in a hurry the other night, Cade. You dropped this after you set fire to my shack." The sheriff's face went pale. "That is a lie. That could be anyone's." "Perhaps," Elias conceded. "But is it also a lie that you conspired with a clerk in the Territorial Records Office to forge that deed in your hand, a man named Abernathy, who has a weakness for card games he cannot afford?" Cade's composure began to crack. "You have no proof." "I have the truth," Elias said, turning now to address the townspeople. His voice was not that of a tycoon, but of a man who had been stripped bare. "It is true that I am Elias Monroe, and it is true that I was a man who let gold poison his soul. I lost everything, and I deserved to. I came here under a false name because I was a coward. But what the sheriff tells you is a lie. He tried to murder me to steal a mine he believed was rich." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And that is the greatest lie of all. The mine is worthless. I spent weeks in it. The vein is gone. There is nothing left in that ground but rock and dust." A collective sigh of disappointment went through the crowd. Their one last hope of a boom was gone. "The real value in this town," Elias continued, his voice ringing with a new and powerful conviction, "is not under the ground. It is standing right here. It is in your hands and your hearts. I came here to take from this town, but I am leaving my claim, worthless as it is, to you, not to the township, to be controlled by men like the sheriff, but to the people. Form a cooperative. Work it together. If there is anything left, share it. If not, you will have lost nothing. The deed will be legally transferred to a committee of your choosing. My past is my own, but this small piece of the future belongs to Dust Haven." A stunned silence fell over the square. This was not the act of a swindler. This was the act of an honorable man. Then Elias turned away from the crowd, away from the now trembling sheriff. He walked toward the porch of the general store, toward the woman who stood there, her plain face a study in disbelief and dawning hope. The crowd parted for him as if he were a force of nature. He stopped before her, and in the dusty, silent square, Elias Monroe, the man who had once owned mountains of gold, knelt on one knee in the dirt. He looked up at Ada Wren, his eyes full of a truth that was more precious than any mineral. "They said you were too plain, too ugly to marry," he said, his voice thick with emotion but carrying to every corner of the silent square. "But I swear, Ada Wren, you are the most beautiful thing this damned West ever gave me." A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on Ada's cheek. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, the people who had whispered about her, pitied her, and scorned her. She saw Mildred Gable's open-mouthed shock. She saw the shame on the faces of her neighbors. Then she looked down at the man kneeling at her feet. A man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. A slow, quiet understanding dawned across the town square. The people of Dusthaven stood in silent witness, not just to a proposal, but to a reckoning, one by one. Men who had known her since she was a child, women who had gossiped about her over their fences, lowered their heads. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken apology. From the crowd, a deputy stepped forward, his face grim. He walked to the sheriff, who stood frozen, the false deed still clutched in his hand. "Cade," the deputy said, his voice heavy, "I think you need to come with me." Cade did not resist. His reign was over, as he was led away. Ada Wren reached down and gave her hand to Elias Monroe. A year later, the wind that swept through the canyon no longer felt like an adversary. It had lost its hot, scouring edge, and now moved with a soft, persistent whisper, like a secret being told between the sagebrush and the sky. It was a wind that spoke of endurance, not hardship. The Black Creek mine was silent. The scars of the fire and flood had been softened by time and weather. The blackened earth now home to hardy desert wildflowers, where Elias's shack had once burned. A new, longer building now stood, its wood still the pale color of fresh-cut pine. It was not a place for digging rock, but for weaving thread. The rhythmic clatter of small looms and the quiet murmur of children's voices now filled the air where men had once cursed their luck. Ada and Elias lived in the small, sturdy house they had built themselves, a stone's throw from the workshop. It was a simple home with a wide porch that looked out over the valley, a valley that was slowly, tentatively, coming back to life. The town's cooperative, formed after Elias had signed over the deed, had found a small, unexpected vein of silver in the old mine. It was not enough to create a boom, but it was enough to keep bread on the tables and to fund the looms and the thread for Ada's weaving school. This morning, Elias was on the roof of their porch, patiently replacing a shingle that the wind had loosened. He was no longer the haunted ghost of a tycoon, nor the dusty, anonymous prospector. The scar on his temple had faded to a thin white line, a permanent reminder of the night he had been reborn in fire and mud. He moved with the easy, unhurried grace of a man at peace with his place in the world. He was a husband, a builder, a man who found his fortune not in the ground, but in the steady rhythm of a life built with his own two hands. Ada stood in the doorway of the workshop, watching him. A small girl with bright, curious eyes and a smudged cheek stood beside her, holding up a piece of woven cloth, a slightly crooked but vibrant swatch of blue and yellow. "Is it right, Miss Ada?" the girl, whose name was Sarah, asked. Her parents had been lost to a fever the previous winter, and like the half-dozen other children in the workshop, she had found a new beginning here. Ada ran a gentle hand over the cloth. "It is a beautiful start. Sarah, the tension is much more even." She had discovered a new purpose in teaching these children, in giving them a skill that was about creating, not taking. The town no longer called her plain Ada. They called her Miss Ada, and they said it with a respect that had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with her heart. She looked up at Elias on the roof, and he caught her gaze. He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It was a smile she knew as well as her own reflection, a smile that had healed every crack in her soul. In his eyes, she was not plain or ugly. She was simply Ada, the woman he loved. And that was the only truth that mattered. The year had not been without its challenges. There had been awkward apologies from people like Mildred Gable, which Ada had accepted with a grace that left them feeling more ashamed than absolved. There had been the trial of Cade Morrison, who was now serving a long sentence for attempted murder and fraud. But mostly, the year had been quiet. It had been filled with the small, sturdy moments that build a life shared meals, long walks in the cool desert evenings, and the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. They were not rich, but they were free, free from the ghosts of the past, free from the judgment of others, and free to simply be themselves, together. Sarah tugged on Ada's sleeve, pulling her from her thoughts. The little girl looked from Ada to Elias on the roof, and then back again, her expression serious. Children, Ada knew, had a way of asking the questions that adults had learned to avoid. Miss Ada, the girl began, her voice small. Was it true what my pa used to say the old-timers said about you? Ada looked down at the child, her heart giving a small, familiar pang. Not of pain, but of memory. She knew what the girl was asking. The old whispers, the ghosts of words that had once defined her existence, still lingered in the town's memory, passed down in stories. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She smiled. A soft, genuine smile that held the wisdom of a woman who had walked through fire and found her own worth. She looked up again at her husband, who had paused in his work, hammering a nail into the new shingle, a simple, perfect sound of a home being made secure. He winked at her. They said many things. Child, Ada said, her voice gentle as the canyon wind, but love does not listen to rumors. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.